when we look at England in the 16th and the 17th century, there's another crime that really begins to worry people more, and that they become more likely to view as a serious crime and to try harder to stamp out, and that's witchcraft. Now, if we have a look at witches from the point of view of beliefs of the time, then a witch was believed to be somebody who had made a pact or an agreement with the devil, who is a figure from the Christian belief system who is really representing evil in the world and works against God and works against the church in the supernatural realm to make the world a more miserable and a more sinful place. So as a result of this pact, witches are then thought to have magical powers. And these were often being able to curse people so that they or their families or their animals got sick and died. They were also believed to be able to fly, and they were thought to have something called a familiar, which looked like a harmless domestic animal, like a cat or a dog or maybe a mouse or a spider. This picture is taken from the time, and this witch has an owl, but in reality this was a demon in disguise living with the witch and helping her to carry out her evil schemes. As a part of this as well, witches were believed to have something called a witch's teat, which was a mark which acted like a nipple from which they could feed the familiar. So anything like a wart or a birthmark or some other sort of deformity would be seen as evidence that somebody was a witch. Now, these are all ideas about witches from the time, but they're not new by this point. In fact, they've been accepted by people for hundreds of years as part of their belief system. So in the Middle Ages, witchcraft was a crime, and it was generally tried by the church courts, and the punishments were really, by the standards of the day, quite lenient. So things like a few days in the stocks, for example, might be the punishment for witchcraft. However, in the 1500s that changes. Now, it's difficult for historians to know exactly how many people were tried and punished as witches because a lot of the records don't exist anymore. But estimates for between the years of 1542 and 1736, and I'll write those down because they're hard to remember, 1542, 1736, estimates put the number of people who were executed as witches, possibly by hanging, at about 1,000. So this is a crime that's become much more serious in the eyes of the authority, and that is being punished more frequently and more harshly. Now, a good way to understand this is to look at the historical context of the time, because that gives us some insight into why people start to worry about this crime so much. For one thing, there's a lot of religious instability, beginning in the 1530s really, when Henry VIII breaks with Rome. And England becomes more Protestant, but it does go back and forth, and there's a lot of disagreement between people about the best way to be a Christian. And in some cases, people view people with different beliefs to their own with a lot of suspicion. Protestant preachers used to tell their congregations that the Catholics were actively working against God and actively working against the church. Now, if you take witchcraft, which is a religious crime, then in an environment where people are already anxious about people targeting them because of their beliefs, the idea that there are people who are working against God is extra scary. And in addition to this, remember that when Henry breaks with Rome, he becomes the head of the Catholic Church. So whereas witchcraft used to be a crime against God and the church, it's now a crime against God, the church, the king and the country. So it becomes more serious from that point of view as well. Also, after 1500, there's about a 150-year period of what we'd call economic instability as well, where there's a lot of change and it's harder for people to make a living. a lot of people become very poor, a lot of people don't have jobs, and there's much greater inequality as well between the people who are quite wealthy and growing in wealth and the people who aren't. So that creates another environment of suspicion, and it's particularly against poor people. People are worried about the poor, they're worried about vagabonds, and they associate the poor with crime. So that creates more suspicion as well. Finally, in the 1640s, there is a civil war between the king and Parliament. And like all civil wars, which are where a country fights against itself, this is a fairly nasty event. It's very divisive. It breaks up families in some cases because they disagree over who to fight for and end up fighting each other. It's very disruptive. It causes a lot of economic uncertainty and a lot of political uncertainty. And crucially as well, I think, it means that people with a lot of power in their communities, in their local communities, aren't necessarily being kept in check by the people above them. And there's nobody to keep an eye on them because the king and the parliament are both fighting. So the civil wars cause a lot of instability as well. And when we look at the periods when the witch trials are at their height and when there's most witch trials, it's really the end of the 1500s, that's a 1580s to 90s, and also this period in the 1640s when the Civil War is going on, because it's a very unstable environment where people are feeling very anxious and worried and looking for ways to solve that. Now, if we match this up with what we know about the people who were accused of being witches, that sort of backs these ideas up, because to begin with, a lot of people who were accused and convicted of being witches were very poor, and quite often the accusations of witchcraft against them came from richer people. And this makes sense if you think that there were more poor people and perhaps they were asking richer people for more help and the rich people didn't like it. Perhaps they felt resentful towards the richer people and the rich people felt anxious and worried about that. So quite often witches were poor. Another point to make about witches is that they were, in the vast majority, 90% of them in fact, were women. They were female. And this presents a problem because of the way that women are supposed to be in that time period. So the role of women at the time, they were supposed to be domestic and look after the home. They were supposed to be the property of men. So women actually belonged to their father until they got married, and then they belonged to their husband. They're supposed to be very submissive and weak as well. And this is actually one of the reasons why women were more likely to be suspected as witches, because women were supposed to be weaker in the face of the devil's temptation. But again, when we go back to the people who were accused of being witches, quite a lot of them are vulnerable in some way, and that's often because they live alone. They don't have a man to speak up for them and to protect them. So that's another feature of this. They're not conforming to the way that women are supposed to be in that way. Quite often the cases of witchcraft begin with an argument, or where the accused witch is making a nuisance of themselves. And again, this really challenges the way that women are supposed to be as well. Finally, it's worth saying that there were some people who were called wise or cunning women. And those would be women in the days before people could afford good medical care. There might be a woman in the village who was an authority on things like childbirth and rudimentary medicine and health. And they were often accused of being witches. And again, that might be a reflection of the fact that they're not doing what women are supposed to be doing because they're in a position of authority. So there's that to bear in mind as well. I think finally, when we look at the whole period, it's worth bearing in mind that these were scary times and there was a lot of change, and people, ordinary people, really didn't have a lot of control over what was happening to them. And when you're in a position of not having very much control, sometimes it can be quite nice to feel like you've found a way of taking control. Whether that's by identifying witches and ridding yourself of evil in your community, or whether it's by believing that you yourself are a witch and can make things go your way through magic. So I think that's important to remember as well. We're just going to run through some of the laws that were passed about witchcraft to finish up. So we've seen that witchcraft was punished quite leniently in the Middle Ages. That changes in 1542 when Henry VIII passes a law called the Witchcraft Act. And under this act, it becomes a crime that is punishable by death, even if nobody has actually been proved to have been harmed or killed by the witch. Now that law kind of dies when Henry does in 1547, until Elizabeth in 1563 introduces a law called the Conjurations, Enchantments and Witchcraft Act. Quite a lot of writing, this law. Witchcraft Act. And again, that makes witchcraft punishable by death, although this time only if it's proven that the witch has harmed or killed somebody. Elizabeth, though, is then replaced by James I, and James I has two significant interests. One is in writing books, and the other one is in witchcraft. So in 1597, before he's even become King of England, he publishes a book called Demonology. And this is really a study of hell, but it does talk quite a lot about witches, who he calls slaves of the devil. And in it, he encourages people to keep their eye out for witches. And he gives them some ideas about how to identify a witch. So he encourages witch hunts with this. And he also gives advice about how to run a good witch trial. James believes that children should be allowed to give evidence in witch trials, even though English law at the time didn't allow people who were under the age of 14 to give evidence in the courts. And in 1612, there is a case called the Pendle Witch Trial near Burnley, in which a 9-year-old girl called Janet Devise gives evidence against her family, some of whom are then executed. So children were used as to give evidence in witch trials on some occasions. Now, in 1604, James passes a law called the Witchcraft and Conjuration Act. So 1604. And under this law, witches can be punished and executed for summoning evil spirits. So again, it perhaps becomes slightly easier to execute people for witchcraft with this law. Also worth saying that James deals with the Gunpowder Plot in 1605, which is where Catholics try to blow him up with gunpowder. And again, that makes him very anxious and very worried and perhaps a bit paranoid about plots and religious differences and people being out to get him. Now that's the way the law stays until much later on, after things have changed a lot. In the time of George II, there is a law in 1735 called the Witchcraft Act. And that really treats witchcraft and witches as con artists, like a big scam. And under the terms of this act, witchcraft turns into something that is punished by a fine or something that can be punished by prison. Actually, the last execution for witchcraft was in 1716. So by the 1700s, the witchcraft craze and the trials and the witch hunts have died away. But for 200 years, they've been something that have been really significant parts of crime and punishment. I'll see you later.